The kitchen sat in shadows, its silence louder than thunder. A single plate rested on the table, empty, cold, lifeless. His stomach growled, but his pockets were empty too. That night, hunger wasn't just in his body, it burned in his soul. He looked at the plate, then at the ceiling, whispering to himself, "This ends here." In that moment he made a promise. Never again would hunger decide his story. His fight had just begun. Back then, no one cared who he was. His name carried no weight, no spark, just another face in a crowd that looked past him. He lived in a forgotten corner of a small town, where dreams were smaller than the cracked walls around him. His kitchen tools weren't shiny chef knives, only a pan chipped with years of use and a handful of spices borrowed from neighbors. Still, when he cooked, something magical stirred. But magic means nothing when the world doesn't know your name. And his was a name forgotten. The house he grew up in was never a home. It was a shelter stitched together by worn bricks and silent prayers. When rain came, water slipped through, the cracked roof, dripping into bowls scattered across the floor. Each drop echoed like a reminder of how fragile life was inside those walls. The bulbs above his head barely worked. They flickered weakly, leaving the room half-lit, half-swallowed by darkness. Shadows stretched across the peeling walls, as if even light was too tired to stay. But the hardest part wasn't the storm outside or the cold air creeping in. It was the sound of his mother's cough. A dry, aching cough that pierced the night, leaving him awake, helpless, and angry at the world. Medicine was out of reach, doctors a dream. All he could do was listen and wish. Food was scarce, warmth was a privilege, and dreams seemed like distant luxuries reserved for other children. Yet within this crumbling house, something unshakable was being built. Struggle became his teacher. Hunger carved resilience into his bones. Watching his mother fight pain taught him what true strength looked like. And though no one knew his name, though the world had already dismissed him as another boy destined to disappear, the fire inside him grew. If he could survive here, among leaking roofs and restless nights, then maybe he could survive anything. This was more than hardship. It was the silent training ground of a forgotten child, a boy whose empty home would one day give birth to a dream far bigger than its broken walls. Amid the leaking roof and flickering bulbs, there was one place where he felt alive, the small corner of the house they called a kitchen. The pans were cracked, the knives dull, the ingredients borrowed or bought with the last few coins his mother could spare. Yet when his hands touched food, something shifted. It was as though the hunger inside him transformed into energy, guiding every cut, every stir, every flavor. Neighbors would often stop by, drawn by the smell of spices floating through the thin windows. They whispered among themselves, amazed at how a boy with nothing could make a handful of rice taste like a feast. "This kid's hands have magic," they said, shaking their heads in disbelief. It was more than cooking. It was storytelling. With food, dishes that spoke of comfort, of warmth, of love that refused to die in poverty's grip. But magic never filled his empty pockets. For every smile his food created, there was still a bill unpaid, a medicine unbought, a night gone. Hungry, joy could be found in flavor, but survival demanded money, and money was something his family never had. Still, cooking gave him hope, and hope was fuel. He dreamed quietly as he worked. What if this magic could reach beyond the broken walls? What if these hands could build a life where his mother's cough no longer echoed through sleepless nights? These thoughts kept him moving, even when exhaustion begged him to stop. In those moments, the kitchen became more than a place of struggle. It was his sanctuary, the only place where poverty couldn't win. Every dish reminded him that he had something no one could take, a gift that could transform hunger into hope. The world may not have remembered his name, his house may have been forgotten, his family overlooked. But when he cooked, even if, just for neighbors, even if just for one meal, the world felt alive. And deep down he knew this spark was more than survival. It was a seed. A fragile seed, yes, but one that would one day grow into something far beyond whispers, something powerful, enough to change his life and the lives of countless others. Hope lit his hands, but the world didn't see it. When he applied to culinary schools, he carried nothing but passion and borrowed dreams. He stood in line among polished shoes, ironed coats, and confident voices. He had none of that, just calloused palms and a fire no one could measure on. Paper. One by one, letters came back, cold printed words that crushed him. "We regret to inform you." They weren't judging his food, his magic, or his hunger, only his background. No money, no pedigree, no chance. The rejection spread beyond institutions. His own peers mocked him, their laughter sharper than knives. "Chef, you? Look at your shoes. Look at your house. Better get a real job." Their voices followed him. Home, louder in his head than the storm pounding on his roof. Days turned into weeks, and his knives, once alive with ambition, began to rust in silence. Dust collected where sparks of joy once danced. He still cooked, but each cut felt heavier, each flame weaker. The boy who once stirred hope into every dish now felt the weight of a world that refused to believe in him. And yet rejection carried its own strange gift. It didn't erase his hunger, it deepened it. It didn't silence his dream, it sharpened it. Because somewhere, under the laughter and the rust, lived a voice that refused to die. You are more than what they see. The first burn had scarred him, but it also reminded him, scars can hurt, but they can also harden. And though the world mocked him now, he quietly prepared for a moment they would never see coming. Rejection had left scars, but hunger left. Wounds deeper still. He found work where he could, chopping onions for street vendors, stirring pots in back alleys, flipping bread in kitchens that weren't his. He cooked for strangers, served them steaming plates, and watched their faces light up with satisfaction. But when the flames died down and the customers left, he was the one left empty. He carried the smell of food home on his clothes, a cruel perfume that mocked his growling stomach. Some nights he would lie on the floor beside his rusting knives, the scent of roasted meat or fried rice still clinging to his skin, while his own plate stayed bare. The hunger wasn't just physical. It was emotional, almost spiritual. Imagine creating beauty, golden bread, tender meat, warm curries, only to never taste them yourself. Each bite he handed away was a reminder of what he couldn't have. His body ached, his lips dry. But his pride refused to beg. Neighbors sometimes asked, "Don't you eat what you cook?" He would smile faintly, nod, and lie. Because admitting the truth, that a chef went to bed hungry, felt like another rejection, one he couldn't bear. On those nights, sleep came slowly. His stomach twisted, his head spun, and in the silence, he promised himself, "This is temporary." The hunger that haunted him would one day feed his ambition. The emptiness of his stomach would one day be replaced by the fullness of success. And while most people see hunger as weakness, for him, it became fire. Fire that burned through rejection. Fire that kept him alive when hope flickered dim. Fire that whispered, "Your story isn't over." Every night he slept hungry, his dream grew hungrier too. And soon that hunger would demand more than survival. It would demand a chance to fight back. Hunger was already his daily companion, but mockery made it sharper. The world didn't just doubt him, it laughed at him. Friends who once shared meals with him now smirked at the idea of him becoming a chef. "Chef, you?" they sneered, pointing at his torn shoes, the faded shirt that carried stains from kitchens that weren't his. Every word felt like a knife twisting, carving doubt deeper into his chest. Laughter has a way of echoing louder than encouragement. Their voices followed him long after he walked away, ringing in his ears while he stirred pots and wiped plates. No matter how hard he tried to silence them, their ridicule sat at the table with him, louder than his own courage. At night, when he lay in the dark with an empty stomach, he replayed those taunts. "Get a real job. You'll never make it." The words blended with the smell of food he couldn't taste, with the sound of his mother's cough in the next room. Together they became a chorus of pain, and yet somewhere inside he refused to bow. He didn't have the shoes, the coat, or the title. But he had something they couldn't see, the memory of faces lighting up when they tasted his food. That memory was his quiet defense, his hidden weapon. The mockery broke pieces of him, yes, but it also hardened him layer by layer like steel in fire. And though their laughter haunted him, it also whispered a challenge. Prove them wrong. What they didn't know was that every cruel joke, every pointed finger, was feeding the very hunger that would one day silence them all. The laughter of his so-called friends wasn't the only wall he faced. Reality had sharper edges. Day after day, he walked into restaurants, not asking to be a chef, not even to cook, just to wash dishes, to stand near the heat of a kitchen. But each time, the answer was the same. A quick glance at his worn clothes, a shake of the head, the cold slam of a door. To them, he wasn't a dreamer with talent. He was just another poor boy looking for scraps. Every rejection felt heavier than the last. His courage shrank with each slammed door, like a candle burning down to its final flame. The kitchens he longed to step into became fortresses he could never breach. Some nights he wondered if his friends were right. Maybe chef was too big a word for someone with nothing. Maybe dreams were only for those who could afford them. Yet as painful as those doors were, he kept knocking. Because even when the world tried to crush him, a quiet fire still burned inside. And with each rejection, he whispered to himself, "One day, these same doors will open, and they will beg me to walk through." The sky itself seemed to mock him that day. Clouds hung heavy, grey and unforgiving, and the rain fell in sheets as he walked out of yet another restaurant. His clothes clung to his skin, water dripping from his hair, his shoes squelching with every step. He had begged again, only for the manager's eyes to sweep over him with disdain before delivering the same crushing verdict. "We're not hiring." He stood in the street shivering, holding the weight of rejection like a stone on his chest. All the laughter of his friends, all the slammed doors, all the hunger and sleepless nights collapsed into that single moment. The rain blurred his vision, but it wasn't just rain. It was tears he no longer tried to hide. For the first time he felt his dream slip from his hands. The voice in his head, usually steady with defiance, cracked. "Maybe they're right," he whispered into the storm. "Maybe I'm nothing." The words stung more than the rain, because deep down part of him feared they were true. He pressed his back against a wall, slid down to the wet ground, and hugged his knees. Around him, people rushed past, umbrellas shielding them from the storm. No one noticed the boy sitting in the rain. No one cared about the dream dying quietly on that sidewalk. Minutes stretched like hours. The sound of rain drumming on the pavement became the soundtrack of his despair. He thought about his mother's cough, about the empty plates, about the knives rusting back at home. Was he foolish to think he could rise from nothing? Was he chasing an illusion too big for his hands? But as the storm raged, another thought crept in, faint but alive. Maybe he was nothing now, yes. But was he destined to stay nothing? Or could this very breaking point become the place where a new version of himself was born? The rain didn't stop, and neither did his doubts. Yet somewhere within the darkness, a fragile ember of hope remained, waiting for the right spark. This was the lowest point of his journey, the night the dream almost died. And yet, from ashes often comes the first sign of fire. Just when his dream was at its weakest flame, life placed him at a crossroads he never saw coming. With no job, no school willing to take him, and no doors opening, he dragged himself to the street corner where smoke from small food stalls curled into the night sky. He had only a few coins left, just enough to buy a handful of ingredients. With shaky hands and a heart full of doubt, he lit a tiny stove and set up a makeshift stall. Nothing fancy, a battered pan, a wooden spoon, and a smile he tried to force through his exhaustion. At first, people walked past without looking. To them, he was just another poor boy with another stall. But then one man stopped, a stranger. His eyes tired, his steps slow, as though he too was carrying unseen burdens. He bought a plate. The boy handed it over, expecting nothing. Yet as the stranger took his first bite, something unexpected happened. His eyes welled up with tears. He looked at the boy and whispered, voice trembling, This tastes like my childhood." The words cut deeper than any rejection ever had. In that moment, the boy realized something powerful. Food wasn't just about survival. It was memory. It was emotion. It was connection. The stranger walked away, but his words remained, and with them, something inside the boy shifted. For the first time, he felt his dream wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who longed for comfort, for home, for a taste of hope. The rain, the hunger, the rejection, none of it mattered in that instant. Because he had found his spark. And once a spark is lit, a fire cannot help but grow. That stranger's words refused to leave his mind. This tastes like my childhood. Simple, trembling words. But they echoed louder than all the rejections, louder than all the laughter. For the first time he saw his gift not as a burden, but as a bridge. He lay awake that night on the cold floor of his home, staring at the leaking roof as raindrops tapped against tin. His stomach was empty, but his mind was full. If food had the power to make a grown man cry, then maybe food could do more than fill bellies. Maybe it could heal wounds no doctor could touch, wounds of memory, of loneliness, of loss. The idea planted itself firmly in his soul. His cooking wouldn't just be about feeding. It would be about feeling. Every dish would carry a story. Every bite would whisper of comfort. Every plate would remind someone that they mattered. He closed his eyes and imagined it. A small place where people could gather, not just to eat, but to belong. A place where flavors carried emotions, where recipes were chapters of his journey, where meals felt like homecoming. And then, the vision grew bolder. What if this idea could expand beyond one stall, one street, one city? What if kitchens across the world could carry the same warmth, the same spark? For the first time, the word empire slipped into his thoughts, not an empire of steel and glass, but an empire of flavor and love. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. Poverty was still pressing, resources still scarce, and the world still doubted him. But an idea that strong doesn't wait for permission. It demands action. That night, hunger no longer felt like defeat. It felt like fuel, because now he wasn't just chasing survival. He was chasing a vision, one that could change not only his life, but the lives of everyone who ever needed comfort served on a plate. The boy with a forgotten name had finally found a purpose the world could not ignore. And from this idea, the journey truly began. Dreams are born in the heart, but they demand a price from the hands. For him, that price came in the form of his only treasure, his father's old watch. It wasn't just metal and glass. That watch was memory. It had ticked quietly on his father's wrist through years of sacrifice, through nights of struggle, through lessons of survival. Every scratch on its surface told a story. Selling it felt like betraying the past. Yet he knew keeping it meant holding on to memory, not future. With trembling fingers, he placed it on the counter of a small pawn shop. The shopkeeper weighed it, uninterested in the emotions it carried. Coins clinked into his palm, far less than the watch was worth, but just enough to start. That evening he carried home flour, rice and oil. Simple things, yet in his hands they felt like gold. For the first time he wasn't cooking out of desperation, but out of determination. This was no longer survival. This was investment. The neighbors watched as he lit his small stove, curiosity in their eyes. He didn't tell them about the watch or the sacrifice behind each grain of rice. But as the flames rose, he knew this was the first true step. He had risked the last piece of his past to gamble on a future no one else believed in. And that risk, however small, would become the seed of everything to come. The watch was gone, but in its place came fuel, bags of flour, rice and oil that marked the true beginning of his journey. By day he cooked. Smoke rose from his tiny stove, drifting into the air as neighbors lined up, coins clutched in their hands, waiting for a taste of what they now called his magic. But it was the nights that defined him. When the streets grew silent and lanterns dimmed, he sat hunched over a wooden table, scribbling notes by the faint light of a flickering bulb. His hands shook from exhaustion, ink smudging the pages. But still he wrote, recipes, ideas, visions of dishes that could carry emotion across borders. Sleep was a luxury he could no longer afford. His body begged for rest, but his mind refused. Each night he asked himself, how can I make it better? How can I turn one smile into 100, 100 into thousands? The hunger that once haunted him now kept him awake, but not out of weakness, out of relentless drive. His mother would sometimes wake to see him slumped over the table, recipes scattered around him like fallen leaves. She'd gently cover him with a blanket, whispering a prayer. And when dawn came, he rose again, hands blistered, eyes heavy, but spirit alive. These sleepless nights were not wasted hours. They were the hidden labor of a dream, still fragile, still unproven, but alive. Every plate he served carried not just flavor, but the weight of those nights. Nights where sacrifice was the only currency, and hope the only reward. And slowly, those sacrifices began to carve the boy into the chef he was destined to become. His world shrank to a single room, 4 walls barely holding together, a low ceiling stained with smoke, and air so thick with heat it clung to his skin. The kitchen wasn't grand, it wasn't even comfortable, but to him it was everything. The stove hissed like a living creature, flames licking the sides of dented pots. The counters were old planks of wood nailed together, wobbling with every movement. The walls carried scars of grease and fire, proof of battles fought night after night. Yet within this chaos he found order. Within this poverty he found possibility. Every dish born in that room carried the smell of resilience. Customers didn't see the cracked tiles or the smoky air. They saw only the food, warm and alive, glowing with the passion of a boy who refused to quit. It wasn't an empire yet, not even close. But as he stood there, sweat dripping, sleeves rolled, eyes burning with exhaustion and determination, he felt it. Greatness doesn't wait for palaces. Sometimes it begins in tiny kitchens, with dented pots and borrowed spoons. And though no one knew it yet, this cramped room was the birthplace of a dream that would one day conquer the world. The tiny kitchen was ready, but dreams need witnesses. For days he cooked as smoke filled the room, waiting for someone, anyone, to stop. Most walked past without a glance. Some sniffed the air, curious, then shook their heads and moved on. Hope flickered like the weak flame under his dented pot. Then she appeared, a woman in a faded shawl carrying a basket heavy with vegetables. She paused at his stall, eyes scanning the pots, then the boy behind them. Her hesitation cut deeper than words. Would she walk away too? With trembling hands he offered her a plate. Simple food, rice, spices, a sauce simmered through the night. She looked at it for a moment, then finally handed him a few coins. He exhaled as if the world itself had just opened its doors. She ate quietly, each bite slow, thoughtful. For him, those moments stretched into eternity. And when she left, she didn't say much, only gave a faint nod. He thought it might be the end, but the next day she returned, while not alone. 2 friends walked beside her, smiling with curiosity. They sat, ordered, and ate. Laughter filled the small room, warmth spilling into the street. That day, he realized, 1 customer could become 2. 2 could become 10. And if he could win hearts with a single plate, then maybe his dream had a chance. The fire had been lit, not just in the stove, but in his soul. The woman's return was just the beginning. Soon, whispers spread through the streets. Not about a restaurant, not about menus or prices, but about a boy whose food felt different, as if each bite carried something more than flavor. People said his dishes carried warmth, comfort, even love. Day by day, the line outside his tiny kitchen grew. Laborers with tired hands, mothers with restless children, students with empty wallets, all found their way to him. They didn't come because it was fancy. They came because it felt human, because for a few coins they were reminded of home. The boy cooked tirelessly, sweat dripping into his collar, hands blistered from the constant chopping and stirring. Yet instead of breaking him, the pressure fueled him. Each new face in the crowd wasn't just a customer. It was proof that his dream was real, that the fire was spreading. His kitchen was still small, his tools still dented, but his heart raced with a hunger greater than his own stomach. This was no longer survival. This was momentum, and deep inside he knew. He couldn't stop here. He needed more. He needed to grow. Growth is a blessing, but it can also be a storm. The boy's tiny kitchen that once served a few now faced crowds stretching down the street. Word had spread faster than he could keep up with, and suddenly success began to carry the weight of failure. Deliveries arrived late when they arrived at all. He would wait by the door for sacks of rice or bundles of vegetables, only to be told they'd spoiled in the heat or been sent to bigger clients who could pay more. Some days he stood in front of a waiting crowd with nothing to serve, shame pressing on his chest, heavier than hunger ever had. The pressure was relentless. His nights, once filled with planning and scribbled recipes, now ended with him collapsing, on the floor, too weak to lift a pen, too tired to even eat. Blisters on his hands split open, his back ached, his eyes burned from smoke and sleeplessness. Yet the faces at his door didn't see exhaustion, they only saw expectation. And fame, even small fame, carried whispers. Some said he was too young, too reckless, that this success would burn out as quickly as it began. Others accused him of cutting corners when meals ran short. The boy who had once been invisible was now being watched, measured, judged. Each failure cut into him like a blade. He feared disappointing those who trusted him, feared losing the fragile empire he'd barely begun to build. But even as exhaustion pulled him down, he refused to close his doors. Because hidden within the failures was a truth he couldn't ignore. Growth demanded more of him than he had ever given before. And if he wanted to rise higher, he would have to pay the price. After months of chaos, exhaustion, and doubts louder than applause, the unexpected happened. One morning, a letter arrived. Thin paper, folded carefully, carrying words that made his hands tremble. "You have been selected for the best street food of the year." So at first he thought it was a mistake. Him? The boy with dented pots, the one who pawned his father's watch just to buy rice? But it was real. His food, born in a smoky one-room kitchen, had been noticed, not just by neighbors or customers, but by people who judged flavors for a living. The award ceremony wasn't glamorous for him. He didn't own a suit, only a clean shirt his mother pressed until the iron hissed. He walked nervously onto the stage, palms sweating as cameras flashed around him. For a moment, the laughter of his old friends, the slammed doors of restaurants, the nights of collapsing from exhaustion, all of it echoed in his mind. But then, as they placed the small trophy in his hands, another sound grew louder. Applause. Real applause. Not for a dream, but for him, for the food he created. For the boy who turned hunger into magic. Standing under the bright lights, he felt something he had never felt before. Belonging. For the first time, he believed he had a place in kitchens far bigger than his own. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't an empire. But it was validation, a voice louder than rejection, a reminder that his journey wasn't foolish. It was his first win, and it would not be his last. One award may seem small, but for him, it was a thunderclap. The trophy, simple and shining, carried his story beyond the smoky walls of his kitchen. Suddenly his name traveled farther than the streets he served. Newspapers came first. Journalists crowded into his cramped room, jotting notes as they snapped. Photos of the boy behind the stove. Headlines appeared, "The broke chef who cooks with magic." Readers across the city devoured his story, fascinated not just by the food, but by the journey, the poverty, the sacrifices, the resilience. For the first time, people weren't laughing. They were listening. Then came the calls. Investors, once blind to his existence, now saw opportunity. Men in suits arrived with offers, eager to turn his gift into profit. Some wanted franchises, others wanted endorsements. Their voices were sweet, their promises golden. But behind their smiles, he could sense the same doubt that once shut doors in his face. Now they didn't question his talent. They questioned how much they could take from it. Still, the world shifted. No longer was he just a nameless boy with dented pots. He had become a story people wanted to tell, a face they wanted to remember. Customers multiplied, lines stretched longer, and whispers became roars. He was no longer invisible. He was known, and yet fame came with pressure. Every dish was now judged, every move watched. Success didn't erase the struggle, it amplified it. He was no longer only cooking for hungry neighbors. He was cooking for expectations, for reputation, for a name that carried weight. As he looked at his reflection in the small trophy's golden shine, he realized something profound. The world finally knew his name, but whether they remembered him as a fleeting story or a lasting legacy, that part was still up to him. The broke chef had become a name the world wanted to remember. Now it was his responsibility to make sure they never forgot it. Fame brought noise, but opportunity brought silence, the kind that makes your heart pound. Among the calls, one stood out. A small property owner, tucked in a forgotten alley, reached out with an offer, a restaurant space. It wasn't grand. No glowing signboards, no polished floors, no golden chandeliers, just a narrow doorway, chipped paint, and a nameplate rusted by years of neglect. Most would have walked past without a second glance, but when he stepped inside, he didn't see broken tiles or dusty counters. He saw possibility. He saw a stage where his dream could finally breathe. The room was cramped, barely enough to hold a dozen tables. The walls smelled of dampness, the kitchen still cold and lifeless. But as he stood there, the echoes of his past filled the space. The empty plate, the hunger, the nights of planning by a dim bulb. This wasn't just a restaurant, it was proof that all of it had led him here. When he signed the papers, his hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight of victory. The boy who once begged to wash dishes in other kitchens now held keys to his own. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was his. And for him, that was everything. The door had finally opened. And once inside, he promised himself he would never let it close again. The alleyway restaurant had given him pride. At last he was no longer a boy begging for scraps. He was an owner, a chef with his own keys, his own tables, his own stage. Hope filled the air like the steam rising from his pots. For the first time, life seemed brighter. But brightness often cast the darkest shadows. He wasn't running the place alone. A partner had stepped forward, promising loyalty, guidance, and shared dreams. Together they planned menus, calculated costs, and envisioned the future. The boy trusted him, not with just money, but with his heart, believing he had finally found someone who believed as deeply as he did. Then, one morning, the unthinkable happened. The partner was gone, the cash box emptied, the savings vanished. Alongside it, invoices piled high on the counter. Unpaid bills, suppliers demanding money, debts staring him in the face. The boy's dream, once glowing with promise, now trembled under the weight of betrayal. The sting wasn't just financial, it was personal. After years of rejection, mockery, and loneliness, he had finally dared to trust, and that trust had been stolen. His tiny empire was left fragile, cracked at its very foundation. In that moment, he learned a truth harsher than hunger. Sometimes, it isn't strangers who break you. Sometimes, it's the hand you thought would hold you steady. Tatis. Boy stood in his restaurant, staring at the empty counter, realizing he wasn't just battling poverty anymore. He was battling betrayal, and the cost of that wound would take more than money to heal. The betrayal left cracks, but soon those cracks became chasms. Bills piled high on the counter, their numbers climbing faster than he could count. Suppliers grew impatient, their knocks on the door turning into angry fists. Creditors shouted through the windows, demanding what he no longer had. Inside the restaurant, the air grew heavier each day. Tables sat empty, chairs stacked against the wall. The once lively scent of spices and sizzling pans was replaced by silence, a silence that echoed failure. One night, long after the shouting outside had faded, he sat alone on the cold floor of his kitchen. His head sank into his hands, shoulders trembling under the weight of everything slipping away. The same hands that once stirred hope now shook with defeat. He stared at the flickering bulb above, the same weak light that had watched him write recipes through sleepless nights. But tonight, there were no recipes, no plans, no spark, only exhaustion, only despair. For the first time since his journey began, he felt truly close to surrender. The boy who once fought hunger with fire now wondered if it had all been for nothing, and in that silence he almost gave up. That night, surrounded by silence and debt, he made a decision. If he was going to quit, he would end it on his own terms. Not with creditors shouting, not with doors closing, but with one final act of love. He walked into the kitchen, lit the small stove, and pulled together whatever ingredients were left. There wasn't much. A handful of rice, a few spices, some vegetables that had nearly gone bad. But as the flame flickered, something inside him flickered too. The rhythm of the knife, the scent of garlic in oil, the bubbling of the pan. It was the language he had always spoken best. This meal wasn't for customers, not for investors, not for awards. It was for the woman who had coughed through nights so he could dream. The mother who had covered him with a blanket while he worked sleeplessly, whispering prayers he never heard. He placed the plate before her, heart heavy yet trembling with quiet hope. She took a bite, paused, then smiled, a simple smile, soft but radiant. In that moment, everything came rushing back. Why he started, why he fought, why he couldn't give up. The debts still waited, the struggles still loomed, but her smile reminded him. His food was never about survival alone, it was about love, and love was reason enough to keep going. Her smile stayed with him long after the meal was gone. It was small, fragile, yet powerful enough to lift him from the floor where despair had left him. He realized then, failure wasn't the end, it was a lesson. And if betrayal had broken him once, it would never break him the same way again. The next morning he rose with a fire sharper than before. He started small, almost invisible, borrowed stoves, borrowed time, but this time he carried wisdom carved by scars. He no longer trusted blindly. Every partnership was weighed, every handshake studied, every coin guarded like gold. He built again, not with hope alone, but with strategy. He tracked every grain of rice, every spoon of oil, every coin, earned and spent. Where once he had rushed, now he calculated. Where once he relied on others, now he relied on his vision. Customers returned, slowly at first, then steadily. They could see it in his eyes, in the way his dishes carried not just flavor, but defiance. Each plate whispered, "I have been broken, but I am not defeated." Nights were still sleepless, but they were different now. They weren't filled with despair, but with planning, structure, and determination. He wasn't just rebuilding a restaurant, he was rebuilding himself. And though he was still far from the empire he imagined, there was something different in him now. He wasn't cooking just to survive. He wasn't even cooking just to prove others wrong. He was cooking with a fiercer hunger, a hunger to rise beyond failure, beyond betrayal, beyond limits. He had risen once from hunger, once from rejection. Now he rose from ashes, and this time he promised himself he would not fall the same way again. It began with a single dish, a recipe refined through sleepless nights, tested on scraps, perfected with the patience of a man who had nothing to lose. When he served it, he didn't expect history, just hope. But the taste carried something different, something unforgettable. Word spread quickly, faster than he could have imagined. One customer told 10 told hundreds, and soon the streets outside his small restaurant swelled with people desperate for a plate. Photos appeared on social media, captions filled with praise. Food bloggers rushed in, declaring it a flavor that feels like home. And then it happened. The recipe went viral. Videos of steaming bowls and smiling faces flooded screens across the country. The broke chef was no longer just a story whispered in alleys. He became a name shouted in kitchens, offices, and households everywhere. With fame came opportunity. Crowds lined up not just in his city but in others, demanding he expand. For the first time, he saw a line stretching farther than his imagination had dared. Investors, the same type who once ignored his calls, now scrambled to reach him. They offered contracts, money, resources, but this time he chose carefully. His trust was no longer blind. He wasn't looking for partners who wanted profit. He was searching for those who believed in the story behind his food. The boy who once begged to wash dishes now held the power to decide who would sit at his table. The breakthrough had come, and with it, the chance to build something far larger than himself. What began in a smoky one-room kitchen now stretched across continents. His first official restaurant overflowed with customers, and soon one became 10. 10 became 50. Each opening was more than a business launch. It was a victory carved from hunger, rejection, and betrayal. Cities lit up with his name. Neon signs glowed in languages he once couldn't read, yet the meaning was always the same: comfort, love, home. In New York, people lined the sidewalks in the freezing cold just to taste his dishes. In Paris, critics praised the warmth hidden in every bite. In Dubai, families gathered around his tables, finding joy in flavors that felt universal. Every kitchen, no matter the country, carried the same essence. Not luxury, not extravagance, but authenticity. It was his story on a plate, served across borders, uniting strangers through something as simple as food. The boy once forgotten had become a man the world celebrated. His name, once met with laughter, now glowed above bustling restaurants across the globe. And as he stood before each grand opening, watching crowds gather, he remembered the promise made to an empty plate long ago: hunger would never win again. 50. Restaurants across continents had turned him into a phenomenon. But fame doesn't stop at doorways. It spills into every corner of life. Soon, the boy who once stood outside kitchens begging to wash dishes now stood on stages lit by cameras. Awards followed, heavy in his hands, gleaming beneath spotlights. They called his name, not as a curiosity, not as a broke chef, but as a pioneer, a man who had changed the way food could be experienced. His story was no longer whispered in alleyways. It was broadcast on television, printed on glossy magazine covers, told to millions who saw him as proof that dreams could rise from hunger. Talk shows invited him, his laughter echoing where once there had only been silence. Photographers captured him side by side with presidents, celebrities, and icons, people whose names had once felt galaxies away from his own. He shook their hands, smiled for the cameras, but in his heart, he was still that boy in torn shoes, remembering how it felt to sit in the rain, whispering, "Maybe I'm nothing." The irony wasn't lost on him. The same world that once slammed its doors now rolled out red carpets. The same voices that mocked him now praised him. But he carried the memory of those nights, the hunger, the betrayal, the despair, as reminders to stay grounded. Recognition had finally come, not just for his food but for his journey. And in that recognition, he realized something deeper. He hadn't just built an empire of restaurants. He had built an empire of belief, proof that broken beginnings could lead to extraordinary ends. Fame had brought him applause. Awards had filled his shelves. Cameras had followed his every move. But for him, none of it mattered as much as what happened quietly, away from the flashing lights. In each of his restaurants, no matter the country, there was one simple rule: no child would leave hungry. A corner table was always reserved for those who couldn't pay, their plates filled. Without questions, without shame. He remembered too well what it felt like to go to bed with an empty stomach, to dream of food he could never taste. And he swore no child under his roof would carry that same pain. Crowds admired his success, but he admired something else: the smiles of children eating freely, their laughter echoing where his silence once lived. To him, that was the true measure of an empire, not the number of restaurants, not the millions earned, but the countless empty plates that had been filled because he refused to let hunger win. His story had started with one empty plate in a dark kitchen. Now it ended with thousands of plates overflowing across the world. And with each meal served, he wasn't just feeding bodies, he was feeding hope. This was his legacy. Not fame, not wealth, but the promise that no dream was too small, no hunger too great, and no beginning too broken to rise. His journey from an empty plate in a dark kitchen to glowing signs across continents carried a lesson deeper than success itself. It whispered a truth carved by hunger, betrayal, and sacrifice. Poverty can steal what you own, but it cannot steal who you are. Money was taken from him. Opportunities were denied. Doors slammed, friends mocked, partners betrayed. Yet through it all, one thing never died: the fire within him. That fire turned sleepless nights into recipes, rejection into determination, and pain into purpose. Dreams, he learned, do not begin in bank accounts. They begin in the soul. Long before his food reached plates around the world, it first fed something invisible inside him, hope. And hope is more nourishing than bread, more filling than rice. It is what keeps a man alive when the world tells him to give up. His story reminds us all it doesn't matter where you start. You may be broke, nameless, unseen, but if your fire burns strong enough, the world cannot ignore it forever. Hunger may bend you, poverty may break you, but dreams, real dreams, have the power to rebuild you. And when those dreams finally feed the world, they prove one thing. Greatness isn't about where you come from. It's about what you refuse to let go of. His story began with an empty plate, yet it ended with tables filled across the world. From hunger to hope, from rejection to recognition, every step reminds us that no dream is too small and no struggle too great. If this journey touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own fire, your own fight, then stay with us because this is just one story among many. Subscribe and be ready for the next chapter. Who knows, the next story might not just inspire you, it might change your life forever.